Gormaga clearly, and firstly I'd like to thank Deputy Batchich for introducing the private members bill. I think it's your first one, Deputy Batchich, in this Dáil since your by-election, so congratulations on that, and thank you indeed for bringing this forward. And it gives me an opportunity here to reflect on a number of the issues that have been touched on during this morning's debate. Everyone here, I think, can agree that there is a need to ensure that the residential sector is both an attractive option for tenants and landlords. We need to have a sustainable and adequate supply of homes to rent to meet the current and future demand. But we need those rents to be at an affordable level. Tenants who are renting need to have the certainty that, as long as they pay their rent and meet their obligations, they will be able to stay comfortably in the property that they are renting. Equally, landlords must have the confidence in the long-term viability of their investment, and that the rental income will be sufficient to cover their expenses over time. And I say that again by reminding colleagues, and I know Deputy Batchich is aware of this, that about 86% of landlords are individual mom and pop landlords who own one or two properties, and they're the ones that I'm particularly focusing on in my remarks. As the Minister for State, Malcolm Noonan, outlined earlier, any legal challenges to be introduced cannot risk weakening, or legal changes, to be introduced cannot risk weakening the stability and confidence in the rental sector. No new law should either intentionally or inadvertently undermine the economic viability of providing rental accommodation, or indeed negatively impact on both existing and future supply of rental units. There are knock-on effects to the wider economy to consider too, and we absolutely need rents to be affordable, but we also need them to be viable. Any new measure should be fair. Any new measure must be capable of withstanding legal challenge too, including a constitutional challenge. In relation to supply, I think we can all accept that there are acute pressures in the rental market right now, driven by a number of factors, but predominantly the rising demand for rental accommodation as we come out the other side of the pandemic, and a constrained supply that's been exacerbated further due to two construction shutdowns over the last couple of years due to the pandemic again. We all know that these factors have led to significant rental price inflation over recent years. However, the long-term solution for the high levels of rent lies in increasing supply, as well as providing transparency and consistency around rent levels. And in relation to that, as you'll know, in July, I introduced and enacted the Residential Tenancies No. 2 Act 2021 to better protect tenants with affordability challenges by extending the rent pressure zones until the end of 2024 and prohibiting any rent increase in the RPZ from exceeding general inflation, as recorded by the Harmonised Index of Consumer Prices. The measure significantly reduces the level of permissible rent increases for about 3/4 of all tenancies which are in RPZs, and in addition to that, until 2025, rent reviews outside the RPZs can occur no more frequently than biannually. It is on an annual basis within the RPZs. And whilst HICP averaged about 0.73% over the last 3 years, I'm absolutely acutely aware that as our economy recovers and people return to work after the pandemic, inflation has begun to rise. Indeed, at the time when I introduced the legislation last July, which I did so expeditiously to deal with the 8% issue, if people recall, I acknowledged that inflation was rising, and I said that it would keep the need for an overall cap under review. And that's what I've done, and I have already asked my officials to re-examine the rent control provisions with the view to introducing an overall cap, so that rents in RPZs will only go up if necessary, I would say that again, in line with general inflation, to a maximum cap. And that's something that we are working on. But I wanted to move quickly in July to deal with that issue, and I have said that we at the time that we're bringing forward a more comprehensive residential tenancies bill, which I'll allude to now in response. One of the cornerstones, though, of Housing for All is also the introduction of the new form of tenure cost rental. And between now and 2030, we intend to deliver at least 18,000, not 2,000, 18,000 cost rental homes, which means that tenants pay the cost of delivering, maintaining and managing the homes only. And already, and we didn't wait for the plan to be launched, the first 25 cost rental homes have been delivered and tenanted at Taylor's Hill in Balbriggan, managed by Clúid. And some of these homes have been delivered at actually 50% reduction in the open market rates. Indeed, on Enniskerry Road and Stepaside, another 50 new apartments there with average monthly rents of £1,200. It's a start, and we've started a new tenure of housing, and actually a model that in my view, stands very well to comparison with Vienna, and is actually, in many instances, a better model than the much talked about Vienna model. But we need to build up that scale to make a real difference across the rental market. The more cost rental units that are out there that people can rent, it will have, in my view, an effect of reducing rents in the private sector. It is a game changer, cost rental. It is the start of a new rental system with fair rent and certainty for tenants. I'd like to address just a couple of items specifically in the bill that Senator Bacic and our colleagues in Labour brought forward. In relation to the Model Tenancy Agreement, I wish to advise that Section 152 of the Residential Tenancies Act already provides that in the development and publication of guidelines for good practice by those involved in the rented sector, the RPT can include a precedent for a model lease of a dwelling. And the RTB right now is currently examining the feasibility of developing a standard lease for the sector, and the requisite legal provision is already in place for them to do so. I'd like to see them doing it. I'm on foot of this bill, and I think we're going to work through this bill to pre-legislative scrutiny. I think that could provide a further impetus for that to happen, because that should happen. In relation to the definition of a landlord, to the issue around expanding the definition of the term, I do recognise that the appointment of a receiver to a dwelling can cause and has caused real difficulty and distress for tenants. And it's critical that the rights of tenants are protected. I remember going back to our times in the Shannon, actually, that a former Minister for Justice saying that they were going to bring forward measures in this regard, and that's not today or yesterday. This needs to be done. Under Section 5 of the Strategy for the Rental Sector, my department did establish a working group between ourselves and Justice, Enterprise and Innovation to examine the scope for amending legal provision. I do want to see that done, and I intend to address this particular issue in the upcoming Housing and Residential Tenancies Bill later this year. But again, I think it's really useful, the bill brought forward by Deputy Bacic, that we can have that pre-legislative piece can feed in to the Housing and Residential Tenancies Bill. But that is something that I have stated before that we should do. In relation to deposits, the Deputy will be aware that, again, in one of the 5 pieces of tenancy legislation I brought forward, Section 7 of the Residential Tenancies Act inserted a new section which applies to tenancies created on or after the 9th of August this year, and a new restriction is in place on the total amount that a tenant is required to pay a landlord by way of a deposit or an advance rent payment to secure a tenancy, equivalent to no more than 2 months. And that's 1 month up front plus 1 month deposit, and no more than that. That applies to students, to all renters. And there was a bill that came forward from the opposition on that, and we brought forward an improvement to make sure it wasn't just student renters, it's all renters. That's in place now. Section 12 on the obligations of the landlord, and this is something we'll need to work through a little bit more, is the reference to deposit and requiring a definition. And I know that's not what you propose to do. The legal definition of a deposit could serve as a term to be circumvented by certain parties who might wish to charge key money, for example. So more work is required in that space. There's an understanding of what deposit needs right now. I think if we legally define it in legislation, we may have an issue, as I said, where people are going to try to do something that is not a deposit by calling it, as I said, some things using other terms like key money. The RTB does consider a security deposit to be a sum of money that is paid by the tenant to a landlord, usually before the tenancy commences. It is still the property of the tenant, and the security deposit is considered the lawful property of that tenant until the landlord establishes a right to it, should that be unpaid rent or damage to property. Just very quickly, the grounds of termination by a landlord and the Part 4 tenancy, as you'll know, the Part 4 rights were extended from 4 to 6 years in 2016. That's welcome. But Housing for All, in the strategy that I published and government published, that security of tenure will be strengthened for tenants subject to legal advice. And we need to do this by legislating for tenancies of indefinite duration. There's a commitment in the PFG. It's further reiterated in Housing for All. And the upcoming government rental bill, be that the tenancy bill I'm doing next or the one after that, there is work going on in this space to look to address tenancies of indefinite duration. I take the point completely around the extension of RPZs nationwide, but that's something that the Housing Agency continually monitors. But we have seen particularly post-COVID, with people moving back to the regions as well. Further increases outside of the RPZs, that some of them are running into double digits, and we don't want to see that. In conclusion, Cahirley, and I'm literally 30 seconds here, we know that the rental market is very dynamic and constantly changing in response to fluctuations in supply and demand. We have to be careful that any abrupt legal or regulatory changes don't undermine the confidence in the sector, add to uncertainty for both tenants and landlords, and unintended consequences can arise. We must be careful. We must all be earnest in our efforts to help to secure homes for our people. And I take this bill in the spirit in which it has been tabled, and it is a useful piece of legislation. We do intend to progress our own rental reforms. I will be bringing forward the residential tenancies bill this autumn. I do think, though, that it would be very useful for the JOC to proceed with the further scrutiny of this particular bill. That's why I won't be opposing it. I think there are useful measures that are in it. There are others that I would question that I haven't had the time to go into here, but I think the JOC might be the time to do that. I heard Deputy Howland and yourself earlier on as well mentioning unfurnished properties as well. That's something that we should look at, that there's a different approach taken in other jurisdictions too. So all of these serve to improve what the sector is. But I think all of us know as well, increased supply is really crucially important because the market's constrained, and also in relation to continuing to push out the cost rental model, which I know your own party do support as well, and did support it the last time you were in government. So thank you for the legislation, and I've tried to address as many of the issues and points that members opposite have raised this morning. Thank you.
Thanks very much.